What's going on, everybody? Gar Hoover here, and today we're going to be looking at my track Retrograde, which I made on the PO-33. I asked you guys to hit 150 likes on my video within a week, and you guys did that. Thank you so much for the support. And so now we're going to take a look at the tutorial and how I made the track. If you want the samples, you can download them in the description below. If you have yet to hear the track, you can check it out up here. And with that being said, let's just get started and break down this awesome synthwave track. Alright, so let's get started as always with the samples. We've got this nice reverby, kind of like a muffled guitar kind of pluck. A little bit almost vocal sounding as well. I made it in Vital. We've got this kind of horn guitar distorted tone I made also with Vital. Sounds pretty good when you mix it in with the rest of the stuff going on for some synthwave. We've got just our standard bass. Sounds pretty good. Kind of some detuned saws. Nothing too complicated. And then just a simple plucked type of tone. And then a longer held out synth lead. So those are the 5 melodic samples that I use for the track. And then down here, we've got our chord, which I've had to extend. I adjusted the trim of it so that it wasn't just one of these quick little chops as the PO-33 likes to do. So I had to adjust the trim so it was long enough to hold out the full length. And then did the same thing with the second chord, so those are used in the verses. And then we've got our other chords, which once again, once you find the start of the chord, you want to stretch it out, extend the trim of it so that it can play out the full note. And that is the chords those are the chords used in the chorus. And then we've got our drum samples, which are kind of Lindrum mixed with some other stuff. You can hear that's a very much a Lindrum snare and kick. And you can hear I've got multiple instances of snares. One of these has the kick layered with it. The other is just the kick or just the snare. And you can hear I layered some of the hi-hats as I always do. So I do that so that I don't need to use multiple drum tracks, and I have everything I need just on one, so that it's easier to program out, which you'll see in a little bit. Alright, so now let's take a look at the intro of the track. Pretty simple stuff. That's all it is, and it loops. So let's start with the first 2 patterns, because this essentially is that first chord held out. Let's start with the chord itself. So we hear it held out nice and long. It triggers and it just goes through this first pattern. Second pattern, because it was cutting out, it wasn't making it all the way to the end, I figured out a solution. And I would let just a portion of the chord loop. And I would trigger it every fourth or quarter note, excuse me. So it adds that pad, but then because it loops at the same point, it kind of gives it this a little bit more of a rhythm to it, which is great. I mean, it did the same thing with we have the initial hit, and then so the second instance of the chord that's triggered, and then we have the second one, which is, and then trying to figure out, so that's essentially what I did when I recorded it in. We can also hear what's going on here in this first pattern. If we hold down sound, we've got this guitar kind of tone that just carries on. All I do is trigger it one time. Very simple. Triggered, nothing else. So it just kind of adds that additional texture, that high-end presence, which is needed, especially with such a smooth chord that we have playing underneath it. And then we also have the drums going on here. And the drums are pretty basic too. We've got our kick with a hi-hat layered on it. And then we have the kick with the snare layered together. So then we just have a steady kick going down in quarter notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is what we've got going on there. But then we also have a few other percussive elements. We've got the open hi-hat triggering. And then right here on the 16th step, we have that little sound going on, kind of like a hi-hat, but it's definitely an electronic hi-hat that is being sequenced. And it kind of creates that kind of groove that's a little bit different than what you would get with a straight rhythm, so it adds a little bit of intrigue to it. And then going into the second pattern, same thing, kick, snare, and then at the end we've got this other thin hi-hat sound. And what I do is, all I'm doing is just triggering it. So rather than it just being, see how you only heard, it was just 2 hits? What I'm doing is holding down the sequence note and then hitting BPM. And now I'm hitting, it says trigger 2. So now it's going to trigger that note twice. So now you're hearing 4 within the range, which would just be 1 or 2 based on how many you sequence together. So that's a great way to get those hi-hat rolls. And then it repeats itself. But there we go, we get the fun Lindrum toms going. And those just, they just sound good. All I had to do was just trigger the high one and then the low one, and it works great. That's on 15 and 16. Kind of allows it to either loop back around one time, as you might hear. Let's just do the ending sample. And loop back to just the original intro, or it plays out into the second portion, which we see here. So nothing new other than we add in a lead line, which is that kind of guitar tone that's a little more muted sounding. So the song, the melody itself is relatively simple. There's nothing technical here. I played it out and then I recorded it in. The one thing at the end, though, that was interesting, I had the lead line come through, and it was like there was just so much emptiness still in the melody that I wanted to add some more presence, because it ends on the third measure. And there was nothing going on in that final pattern, so then I decided to have that same note fade back in. So it's kind of like a reverse delay, or kind of creates this dynamic. And how I did that, I just sequenced in each note and then rolled off the low pass so that it was rolled down a good amount. Let me show you how I do that. Right now it's showing, because I held down a note, it copies all the parameters, and now here it is with a little bit more brightness to it. Let's turn on the filter. So there you hear it clean, and then what I did was just, and then punch it in, and then bring out the brightness a little bit more, punch in the next note, bring in the brightness a little bit more. And that's how we get that hit that kind of fades back in like this cool delay effect. And that obviously works well for looping back around or transitioning into the chorus, which we're going to look at next. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at the chorus. So let's just sequence that in real quick and then play. So that's pretty simple. It's got some good melodies, good chord progressions, but you can hear every single sound is different than what we've heard in the verses except for the drums. And so something that people often experience frustration with the POC operator is the fact that you can only have 4 sounds being triggered and playing at once. Once one sound, you introduce a fifth sound, one of the four will be dropped out, and it's likely going to be one of the drum tracks. So if your drums are getting messed up, it's likely that something's tailing into that next pattern that you don't want to be there. And so let me explain this a little bit with this final pattern of the verse. We already talked about it a little bit. What we didn't talk about, though, is if we look at the chord progression with this pad, that's kind of the looping pad I was talking about, this final note is just a little blip. And why it's a little blip is that it cuts out the remainder of the chord. So it cuts it out and it stops it dead in its tracks on that 16th step, so that when it comes to the chorus, that chord is not carrying on into the chorus, and now allows the chorus chords to start to play out from their bank instead of having that one tail in. Same thing with the melody. The melody here, we've got this note, and what you have to do is make sure, adjust the length of the note. So with the melody tracks, melodic tracks, what's cool with them is that you can adjust the length of the sample and how long it's played out. In this case, I only want it to play 2 steps and then it's going to stop. Because the best part about that is if it loops around, we have a note on the first step in the beginning of the pattern, so it doesn't feel jarring or strange when it cuts out. But when we go to the to the chorus, we don't want that melodic sound to continue on because we're going to introduce a new melody and a new sample. So that cuts it out and then allows it to hand it off to the other melody that we're going to be playing instead. So that's really important with pocket operators, learning that if you're having something that's cutting out, it's likely that you have more than 4 tracks playing at once, and 4 is the limit. So be sure to share those tracks well. So if we go from the verse to the chorus, you'll hear the difference. And I'll hold down the sound button so we can see the differences in sounds that are being triggered. And then we have these two and this new chord progression starting off. So it's really cool to see that all play out. With that being said, let's look at the drums of the chorus. They're pretty similar to what we've seen already. We've got the kick, layered kick with the hi-hat, and then we have the layered kick with the snare on the quarter notes, as we've talked about already. We even have this same open hi-hat that we have on the 3rd step, as we had seen up here, right there as well. It's reoccurring. So there's some similarities, and it keeps the groove going. And then we have these other hi-hats. And you might have heard, when I held them down, they're a little bit quieter. And so what this does is it's actually enhancing the groove a little bit. Yes, it's not really swung, but with the hi-hats being a little bit quieter that aren't on the quarter notes like we see with the kicks and the snares, it kind of adds this kind of tottering effect that is really subtle. You hear it a lot with drummers live. And that was something I wanted to make sure that we had here with this limb drum effect with the kind of live drum feel. And so you'll see each one of these hi-hats is a little bit quieter than the rest of the drums that are playing, so it just kind of has that groove to it. And with every other pattern, it essentially is the same thing as what we heard in the verses. So what I mean by that is we have the same little hi-hat tone that we were talking about originally also playing out in it. If we look at it, right, it's on 16 and then it's on 2. So it has that little alternating kind of feel that kind of keeps it away from just being a really straight beat. And then at the end, we still have our hi-hat that's being double triggered here, that other hi-hat roll. Obviously, it's not having both of them because we want to emphasize this other hi-hat in play, but it still adds a little bit of texture to it. Next up, so the only other thing that's different than the other patterns with their drums are these toms that we have play out instead. If we go to, this pattern. So we have those do. And what I did was I increased the pitch of the highest tom for just this step, and then it drops down to its original tone, original pitch, and then we have the lower tom play out. So if we look, both of these are technically the high tom. One's just pitched up higher, and I punched that one in individually, and then I punched in 15 and 16, just like that. Nothing too crazy. Next up are the chords. Chords are pretty crucial for this groove that we have going on here. So originally I had one idea for the chords and I recorded them in as that. And then once I got them on the PO-33 and I was punching in the chords and kind of feeling it out, I found this other groove that I liked as well. And so I had that take the lead instead. And so that's what we have going on here. And so this is pretty simple. I'm not going to go too crazy with it, but you always have the one on the first step, and then you have these two other ones that are kind of on the offbeat that kind of throw it a little bit instead of keeping a straight rhythm. And then again, so each time we see that, if you look at each pattern, you got one on the one, and then two down here that are kind of on the offbeat. And then in the second pattern, nothing on the one, two on the offbeat. And then for 7, once again, 2 on the offbeat at the end. And then for 8, we've got 1 on the offbeat at the very end. So it's constantly kind of this bounce, kind of push that we feel with the chords. So they create a little bit more tension than feeling really static and straight and having them always on the 1 or with the kick and the snare. We kind of have them on that offbeat, so it adds this different feel to it, which is really great. And then we obviously have the bass, which is really driving. It's just chugging along, nothing too fancy here. I just have it playing the root note of the chord until the chord changes, and then it changes to that root note of that next chord. We have it going down the first vertical row and the second vertical row, so now this is making 8th notes, as you'll hear. So, pretty simple. The one thing that I did do that was a little bit different was on the final pattern. What you hear is I'm just outlining the chord. So I have the first of the chord, the root, the third, the 5th, and the 7th, so that it makes a 7th chord. It's a minor 7th chord that's being played. So it kind of outlines it. It adds a little bit of intrigue before it loops back around. The final thing that we have going on here is this lead line. And so I'm not going to talk about the melody itself. It's pretty simple. I just punched in something I liked. But what I did that was interesting, because I didn't want it to sound static, you can hear it kind of flowing, even right there, kind of in and out of this filter cutoff that is put on it. It's dropping down, coming back up, back down, back up. And what I'm doing is once I had it programmed in, I held down right and made sure I was on filter, and then turned the filter knob and adjusted the low pass filter while holding down right, and that writes it in to the pattern. So then you have this cool automated control, and it makes sure that this sample, which would have been sounding pretty static, which sounds pretty boring honestly by itself, once it has this filter cutoff, it gives it some life, especially just being one note that's triggered over and over and over. Having this effect on it kind of keeps it a little more interesting as it loops around. So that's kind of what we've got going on for that first portion of the chorus, and then we switch it out, right? But first, before anything, everything continues on: the bass, the chords, the drums. The one thing that doesn't is this kind of synth note. And like we did with the ending of the verse, what I did was hold down this note and I twisted it until it said L2. So it's only going 2 steps. And so once this is done, it cuts out and it allows this other synth sound to come into play, which is this pluck sound to end it. So then you hear this cool pluck sound that's at play instead, which nothing too crazy there. I just plucked that in and I figured out a line that I liked with it, and I don't even remember how I played it. something like that. And all I did was just kind of outline the chords that we're already playing. We can hear it one more time just so. And then we have the same drums. Everything's the same except for this new melody that's introduced. And because it's plucked, it kind of has this fun bouncy rhythm. I didn't feel like I needed to do much effects wise, whether that was making a fake delay or putting some filter effect on it. So I kept it clean. So that's actually going to complete this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys learned something from it. This was a pretty simple track to sequence in, but as you can hear, it has really large sound and it's really fun music, obviously. So it's a good time, and it has that great 80s feel. And the biggest thing is always going to be samples. Those are going to make or break your track. And if you want to download the samples, once again, just get them for free in the description. On all of my videos, you can grab them for free in the description. So be sure to check that out if you like any of the sounds in one of my pocket operator videos featuring the PO-33. So with that being said, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. See you in the next video.